Morning, hi Wally.
Hi, Yashaen. Looking forward.
You'll see me just now.
Yeah,
I'm hiding in the
Frank.
background.
Morning, Ajima.
Morning, Skura.
Morning, everybody. How's it, Skura?
How's it?
Morning,
All
Yashaen.
right.
Morning, Skura. Morning, everyone.
Morning, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Morning, Andre. Morning, Ken.
Morning, everyone. Morning.
Morning.
Hi, Ken.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Morning.
Morning, Eugene. Morning, Edward. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Today we have Professor Yashaen Luckan, who's going to be sharing his journey with us. The discussion is going to afterwards just be about how he views the world of architecture, what his experiences have been. So Yashaen Luckan, just gonna read his bio. He's an academic, researcher, and practicing architect. His research includes alternate methods of thinking and practice for socio-economic redress and spatial transformation in the global south. Professor Luckan's research focuses on two distinct yet interrelated fields, namely the transformation of architectural pedagogy and humanistic urbanism, or inclusive cities. He has widely published in these fields, including groundbreaking work in the form of a book titled Recognition of Prior Learning in Post-Apartheid South Africa, an alternative pedagogy for transformation of the built environment profession, which was published internationally but by Routledge. Professor Luckan was recently awarded a Mellon grant for a project titled Unsettling Paradigms, Bridging Oppressive Divide Between Humanities, Arts and Technology, an interdisciplinary humanities curriculum for redress and spatial transformation in post-apartheid South Africa. Luckan serves as academic leader of teaching and learning and Masters of Architecture facilitator at Yashaen, University of KwaZulu-Natal, where he's involved in leading transformative thinking, methodologies, and practice. Over to you, Professor Luckan.
Thank you, Skura, and good morning to everybody. I must say that this is quite daunting because I draw a lot of inspiration from so many experienced architects that I see that join today. So obviously that gets my nerves going a bit. And I hope to do justice with this presentation. Yeah, most people would know me for work in decoloniality and alternative learning pathways. But one of my key areas of focus, and I have a lot of interest, is inclusive cities and what I call humanistic urbanism and spatial transformation. So today's topic is really going to be based on that, the urbanism issue and inclusive and transformative spaces in our city. So I'm going to start sharing now. I trust you can see my presentation.
Yeah, it's coming through. Sure.
Okay, I'm just maximizing it. Okay, I'm going to switch off my video now.
Yeah.
So I've titled today's topic Lessons from Place, Architecture as Agency for Spatial Transformation. And my interest in architecture, developed over time, and you're going to see how just now. But I'm very interested in the kind of urban aspect and how architecture fits into the social, the economic, the cultural context. And that fascinates me about the making of place and how architecture, the social spatial dialogue starts to generate very interesting forms, but how architecture can adapt through transitions. So I'm going to speak a bit about that. Okay, so part one, I was asked to talk about a bit about myself and my journey through architecture. So I'm going to talk about my journey through life and architecture. First, a bit about me and my family. On the top are my parents, and the bottom is I'm very bad at portraits, but that's supposed to be me at the bottom. So my father wanted to be a mechanical engineer. Let me start with my mom on the right first. She had to leave school in standard 6, grade 8. And that was because of certain kind of hardships in the family. She came from a large family, but there were also some kind of social and cultural oppressive and gender exclusive forces within the society that she grew up in things. So she spent her life really taking care of me, and my sister was a year younger than me. My mom, although had to leave school then, she's still an avid reader in her 70s now. She's a very creative person in various ways, artistic, but also through food and that kind of creativity. And she's a very keen follower of sports. So if I miss a soccer, rugby, a cricket, tennis, any match, I get the update from her. My dad, on the other hand, really wasn't interested in sport. He wanted to be a mechanical engineer. But at that time, there were no opportunities due to social injustices, and he kind of became quite frustrated about that. One thing he did do was stand up against injustices. So in his school, he was head prefect, and at one function where he had to hoist the flag, it was the old South African flag. He dropped that deliberately and he was kicked out of school. And then obviously his parents had to go, my grandparents, and getting back in. And on the other hand, he wrote a poem about a black dog and a white dog, and he got kicked out again because they found it was an award-winning one, and then they found out it had a kind of activist, revolutionary flavor to it. And that would also translate into his workplace and his job, and standing up for others than himself he ended up losing his job, and it meant our youth was spent in a household with very little income, where he started to then do his career. He couldn't get into mech eng, but he had he went to technical college and things, and he had skills in drawing and detailing, etc. And he was employed once in I think it was over Arab in the printing office, just doing menial things until they found that he could draw. And then he started to get into structural drafting. And but by the end of his career, he used to actually mentor engineers as well. But during his kind of period of employment, because of his standing up and speaking out, he spent a decade and a half out of the workplace. And it was difficult to get back, so he had to do some upskilling in CAD and things. But that, that circumstance really deprived us as children growing up, through our youth. And that is what sparked my interest in, here's somebody who has so much skill. He's also an inventor. He has a whole lot of had a whole lot of patents. He's late now. And yet the system in which we kind of articulate professionally was so kind of exclusionary. And that kind of sparked my interest in alternative learning pathways, of which one is RPL. Me, obviously, first generation tertiary, which meant that in my career, and I kind of connect with students now that are first generation tertiary with the difficulties they have, where when you grow up in a household that doesn't understand understand, the meaning of the life, the tertiary life, there are some difficulties, and it's, let's say, more difficult than being, in a family now with when you like second or third generation tertiary. My schooling, I obviously grew up in a historically disadvantaged community, which I'm going to talk about just now. But I never met an architect all my life until standard 8, which is grade 10, and where Rodney Harbour, who was then the town clerk in Tongaat, and I went to Tongaat High School, gave a careers day talk. Now, I was naturally artistic, and I also liked kind of sciences and maths as well, so it was that kind of left-right balance. And what he said really inspired me to think about architecture as a career. And that happened rather late. And because all we knew in our communities were plan drawers, and if somebody called themselves architect, it would be somebody that draws plans, and that wasn't very inspiring. I enjoyed the creative arts, although my school did not offer it, coming from a schooling system that was all segregated. Very few at that time, House of Delegate schools offered creative arts, but I continued painting, drawing, and making things on my own throughout my life, and I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed literature, poetry, Shakespeare spelled wrong, in high school, and I really enjoyed creative writing. I used a lot of metaphor and things, and now that's starting to make sense in architectural thinking. So that's a bit about my family and background and where I started my career in architecture. Now, moving through my studies, it took me 20 years to become an architect. And in that time, I only had 1 year full-time study. That was in 1996, my BTech year. So I started in 91 to 93, the old national diploma. And in that time, it was structured such that you would study for 6 months and work for 6 months, or study for 3 semesters and work for another 3 semesters, which makes up 3 years. That curriculum focused on architectural drafting, technology, and building science. So it was a very technical curriculum. However, we learned a lot about materials. We learned a lot about the science of the making of buildings, including doing structural calculations. And those skills now, much later, started to actually come into effect very nicely. So I had no regrets going through this hard journey. The next thing, in 1994, I enrolled for the National Higher Diploma. And there was a very interesting module on environmental effects on design, which is so pertinent now as well, and advanced technology. The system at Technikon then changed, where they moved into annual programs in the new diploma. And the BTech degree was offered first time in 95. But for us coming from this old system, we had to do a bridging year, which was third year architectural design. And there I had Len Rosenberg, who was the studio master. It was a very creative studio, and I enjoyed it very much and did well in that, which got me into the BTech degree, my only full year of study in my entire life. I really thoroughly enjoyed this degree, architectural design for urban design. And there, the most impactful lecturer in that program was Karuni Naidu, who took us for urban design and housing. We also had Dick Morton in design for, and our structures then, which Isaac Levy took, was really structural calculations, etc. So it was quite tough, but very interesting. However, from there, what was I going to do? I always wanted to go to Natal University, UKZN, and at that time it was Natal University, to pursue my architectural studies. But at that time, the whole education system was such that it was not easy to articulate and to get in. So which meant that I would have had to get into like second year or something and work my way up. And because I had to work and study all my life, I couldn't afford that. So I decided, let me go and do something completely different. Economics used to fascinate me. I enrolled at UNISA for BCom non-degree purposes to access the honors BCom. And the modules I took in those 2 years was economics, accounting, and business management. And let me tell you something, I enjoyed economics very much. But after having been through a journey thus far in architecture, studying for exams was really easy. I did very well in those courses. Because, and this is something I think many students of architecture don't realize, that architecture requires very high order thinking. It requires synthesis of so many things just to think creatively and make architecture or let architecture become. So studying these subjects for exams was really easy. Okay. In 2001, UKZN started to open up, and they were allowing admissions for BTech students into the BArch Advanced degree. And I submitted a portfolio, and Prof. Rodney Harbour actually contacted us, and a whole lot of us were admitted into that program. And we know what the majors there was: architectural design and theory of architecture and urbanism. And from there, I actually just had my architectural dissertation to finish, which would have been 6 months, but we were told that we could spend another 6 months to a year and, exit with an MArch, which wasn't really the case. It took a few years. So from 2005 to 2008, I was enrolled in the MArch program at UKZN. I can confess now that I enrolled for a full-time degree while working full-time, building my house and doing other things as well, taking care of family, until somebody found out and kicked me out of the program. So I had to get back with some leave. But I completed my architectural dissertation. Sadly, my dad passed away from cancer the month before the dissertation exam. But no excuses, I had to push through. We did advanced architectural design and advanced tech as well. But one interesting thing, and I think the one module that impacted me, and students should know this and other practitioners as well, was research methods. I was fortunate to be taught by 4 professors. Our class was really fortunate. We had Prof. Wally Peters, Prof. Franco Frescura, Prof. Ambrose Adebayo, and Prof. Derek Wang, who all came in with different kind of aspects. And so it made research methods, it gave it a kind of fullness, because each of these professors obviously had different interests. So the methodologies and the way we were exposed to it was extremely interesting. So I enjoyed that very much. And also the architectural theory of architecture and urbanism course. So after that, having struggled through that, I would become an architect 20 years after I exited high school. But I was registered as a senior technologist before that. From 2012 to 2016, I pursued a PhD in architecture. And that, although my master's topic was on cultural identity in the built form, my master's focused on architectural pedagogy and learning space development. And that's because of my work experience in higher education. And I'm going to get to that now. So who did I work for? During my early studies, while completing my national diploma, I worked for Kasim Kadwa Architect in Breer Road, which was quite an interesting experience. It was a short stint, but there were a lot of, I was obviously a trainee there doing my in-service training, so I would be exposed to various projects, which was interesting. It was my first experience of the world of work. After I finished my higher diploma, I got employed at ZAI. I had a wonderful boss there, Brian Lee, who actually recognized a lot of potential that I had, and he could see from my interview that I always wanted to be an architect. I wanted to get out of the system of just drawing and detailing, and I wanted to really, become an architect, think like an architect, and practice like an architect. And I knew what my deficiencies were, and I knew I had to go to university. So that was the stint I did there. I learned a lot. There were a lot of big projects, and he actually got me to handle one of the master planning of one of the projects, and that was quite a daunting task, because I had to oversee work of very experienced people. So I don't know what he was trying to do, but I think he was just trying to bring out something in me, or give me some skill that I needed later on. So in 2001, I was employed on a part-time basis, 97, at ML Sultan Technikon as a academic development lecturer, which meant I assisted lecturers across the board from first year right to BTech. That was really interesting because it exposed me to all different subject streams. But I've also, in 1999, when that term came to an end, Dick Morton, Len Rosenberg, and I formed a close corporation called Architect Studio, and we started to do a lot of work for ML Sultan Technikon that time, the Brickfield Road campus, and then when it changed to DIT, we did all the spatial planning, the boundary walls, the kind of vendors kiosks and Steve Biko camps, and a whole lot of things. So our work was mainly around that, and we did some residential and industrial and cultural centers as well. And that was a very enriching experience. But in 2003, I would become permanently employed at DIT, and which then transformed to DUT. I started off, okay, I mentioned that. I served as HOD from 2009 to 2014. Now, this is important because during my stint as an HOD, I got exposed to various frameworks governing architectural education and practice, etc. And that's what shaped my kind of a critical attitude to a system that really didn't work, which led to where my PhD went, right? So those lived experiences led to that. I currently, from 2016, I've been at UKZN, a very interesting school, which is a school of built environment and development studies. So it's a nice interdisciplinary space, but we're situated in the College of Humanities, which for me works really nicely in terms of my research interests. I'm an associate professor in architecture now, and I'm the school academic leader of teaching and learning, which deals with research-led curriculum and pedagogic approaches and changes as well, adaptation and agility. Enough of that. Now, the two persons I'd say that most shaped my architectural thinking and practice beyond the university is Balakrishna Doshi, architect, and Chris Alexander. Their responsive approaches, Chris Alexander's work on complexity, semi-lattices, his image of the city and notes on synthesis of form and all of that really made sense to me. And I use it a lot in the way I analyze place, and that will come through as we move along. Balakrishna Doshi's approach to communities and his Aranya housing complex, that's the one that really stands out for me, because how the way he was able to achieve complexity through albeit in a low cost housing scheme. So I'll move on now. So where did my kind of spatial perception start? And this is about my childhood home. So back to childhood, to step back. I was born in Sea Cow Lake. I spent the first 9 years of my life there. That was out of the city. And if you look at the plan of the Google Earth images are current, right? But the plan of the house was such that, due to economic circumstances, and my family really, in the early days, they were kind of market gardeners near the Mgeni River down the hill, and subsistence farmers, and then they, went out into other kind of industries and workplaces. But if you look at this, the original house is the one on the left, this rectangular up to family number 7, and the other bit was added on. You can see that there were various families occupying rooms, large rooms in a house. And so what about this? Our living space was this little red outline space, which I'll talk about just now. If you look down here on the left, you'll see that red outline space. We had one bedroom, right? And adjacent to it in a passage, which was closed off, was a kitchen, which had a door to the outside, to the yard outside here. And to access the kitchen, we children had to hop through a window. And as we got a little bit bigger, we could reach the bench below. But that's how this worked. I mean, that was the reality of living those days, just due to economic circumstances. But this experience actually really formed spatial perception, because when living in tight spaces, the outdoor spaces become so relevant. So this stoop, this veranda here with a large oval table, was the core of this. And with so many families, my childhood was filled with cousins and to play with, and when there were birthday parties or even things like Diwali and things, this stoop would become a hive of activity. So my memories of this place are memories of community. The other thing, this Sea Cow Lake community, the neighbors and things, was like one large family. So if anybody had a function, the whole community will kind of gather around it. The other thing is that it was a place rich in culture, and I'm also a musician, and it was there were some of the bands that still exist to date originated there. They used to practice in my house. There was a youth center nearby, although I was too little to be there. My grandfather and his brothers had a boxing club. There was a karate club there. So there was a hive of activities. So as a child growing up in this community, there was a strong sense of community. There was a strong sense of kind of village, and there was a strong sense of community within our home as well. And that was important in forming my perception of place. Trips to town, so Sea Cow Lake was there a few miles away. Traveling along Ngeni Road, we'd access the CBD. And as a young boy, I was really intrigued. I don't know what architecture was then, but I was intrigued by the detailing and the transition between, when we accessed town, we called it town, through Ngeni Road, the bus rank used to be in Beatrice Street, which is still there. And so the journey through town would be through the Grey Street precinct, and you can see the images below on the right. And we'd end up in the West Street kind of and the City Hall area. And I remember stark transitions from walking through these covered colonnades in the Grey Street precinct to having, as a little boy, to cross with, holding my mum or my grand's arms quite tight to cross over where the N3 by Nickel Square parking and things. That used to be a bit traumatic. To get on the other side and transition to a very clean, I want to say clean and cold city, the West Street area and all that. Now, the memories I have of the Grey Street precinct, and my talk is really going to be much about that, was about all those interesting little off streets. And Bond Street was really, really something quite intriguing, because that's where the little shops used to spill their wares, out onto the pavements, beans and all kinds of things. I remember that so vividly. I remember the smells of the spices and the beans, etc. I remember the early morning market, which I didn't really enjoy as a child, going with my granny, because of, you can think about the scale of a child in a market. All you're seeing is butts and tabletops. And so that used to be a little bit not so nice. But the trips to town for me was quite interesting. But what intrigued me about the City Hall, be it colonial or whatever, there used to be some concerts there at night. And my parents used to like going to these Indian artists coming and things. And I remember going there at night, and just the detailing, the uplighting, the stone, the landscaping, the sculptures. That used to leave me in awe. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that my perceptions of place, space, and architecture were actually formed very early. I didn't realize it until I started to reflect on it much later in life. Now it comes to part 2 of my talk, and now I'm going to talk about the colonial coincidence catalyzing the rise of a dual city. So a lot of my my work in inclusive cities is based in the Grey Street precinct. So part 2 of this talk is really about this, and this forms the bulk of what I'm going to say today. Now, a watershed moment in the history of Durban and the rise of this dual alternative city was the arrival of indentured Indians in 1860, okay? Followed by passenger Indians. And now when that happened, and the Indian traders came into the city, the British government at that time started to react, because these businesses started to attract other demands for their goods from various communities. And they were then labeled the Asiatic menace. I refer a lot to Len Rosenberg's book because he's done some great work on this. And if you look at his book, a lot of these diagrams are from there. He goes into detail about these things, right? And the Asiatic menace, so it was this kind of these Indian traders who were seen as vermin in a way. No license, and there was a clause that no license be given to Indians for any building in any of our 3 main streets. So the 3 main streets on this diagram on the map you'll see was Smith, West, and Pine Streets. Those were the 3 main streets, which meant that where were the Indians going to go? Towards the Western Flay, which was a swampy area, right? Then there was another act called the Wholesale and Retail Dealers Licensing Act, which created segregation, confined Indian commerce and retail to the Grey Street area. Now, that was at the same time as you see this image or the photograph here is of West Street during Christmas Eve of 1898. And in 1897, this act was passed, so which meant that the Indian traders started to move out of this precinct into what? What did they have to do? So it was through resilience the second thing was the spatial kind of exclusion and removal of which we spoke about now, gave rise to what was known as a coolie location. So coolie is a derogatory term used for Indians, but that's what it was known as, the coolie location. Now, why I call it this kind of coincidental catalyst for a colonial coincidence? Because these people, through their resilience and coming together communities, actually developed an alternative town, which was this Grey Street in Warwick precinct. Now, as the city expanded, the Grey Street precinct started to grow and expand on its own. And I'm going to get into a few, So if you look at what happened is resilience, displacement, and diversity would lead to an incidental anti-colonial position through the built form. Now, when we look at, let's get back here, architecture, Grey Street, for example, compared to the British town, sometimes, we may look at architecture and, it's inspiring, but architecture always presents a narrative. It always makes a statement. And when we look at it now, one can see how displaced communities, through resilience, actually intuitively or subconsciously created a built form that stands now as an anti-colonial position, all right? I always like analyzing built form also through figure ground analysis. On the left is the Grey Street precinct, on the right is the City Hall. And you can see the kind of difference in, besides the architectural and massing form, if you look at the way the center of the city in the British side compared to what happened in the Grey Street precinct, in terms of the form, the density, the little arcades, little alleys, and all of that. There's a different kind of complexity that expresses in the Grey Street precinct that continues to intrigue me. Now, when I spoke about this anti-colonial position through the built form, I mean, this image really says a lot. It is about Grey Street during that early or late 19th century. And you can see the Grey Street Mosque standing out. It became the place for various things. At one time, the courtyard housed the market as well. It was a kind of backdrop to many through activism and the community gathered around there. And it really, at that time, posed quite a counterposition to what was the colonial narrative. Let's move on. Now, what can we learn through this evolution of the city and this kind of spatial transformation? I realized through engaging with it, through scholarship as well, and also many walks and from little till now through the city, that our city is actually a pedagogical space. All cities are, but I don't think we are actually considering it as much as we should as a pedagogical space. It's a rich gallery from which to learn. And we want to encourage more students and more academics to start and more researchers engaging with this area because it needs to be preserved. Now, sorry. Through my experience with place where I grew up and through my journeys through town, I realized that we need to look beyond, we need to move beyond this obsession with conceptualizing and analyzing and start really engaging through our senses, a phenomenological way. So perception, we need to look, when we're perceiving urban spaces and places, we need to look beyond the abstraction of drawings and maps. And we need to observe people in place and time, which results in urban vitality. And here I talk about the rhizomic layers that underpins the physical system. So whereas Chris Alexander, he refers to this as receptacles. So you design a system, you design receptacles, and let the human activities, that kind of socio-spatial dialogue, vitalize place, so transform what could be just abstract space into place. So place, therefore, has to be regarded as a dynamic and adaptable by human activity, forming a socio-spatial pact. Okay, now let's see where we can find this. Now, this image of Grey Street really, I mean, we can't stand in the middle of that street, but imagine being there. What are we seeing? Are we seeing buildings? Are we seeing a road? I don't even call it a street because it's just full of cars. There are these arcades. And what can we learn from this? Do we just kind of move to the city to access goods and services and miss this rich gallery of narratives? This really intrigues me, and I'm just hoping that more students pause in spaces like this. I hope there are more researchers engaged with this kind of narrative, the statements these forms make, this rich Indian Art Deco that's quite unique to Durban. So just looking at this picture, there are so many things. We can apply some basic principles of rhythm, articulation, massing, and all of that. But layers of culture, looking at the way in a society lived once. But what Grey Street was able to do is that through political and socio-economic transition, the way the spaces were designed were easily adaptable. Now, if you look at the sketch that I did on the top, on the right-hand side, the section, where there were shops originally, and usually the owners would live above or looking onto the street. through transition, this covered walkway, a wide walkway, which was where the shops used to kind of overflow, the goods used to spill out, now become a dialogical situation where informal trade sits opposite formal trade. And Grey Street is one of those areas where it was able to kind of adapt and maintain vitality through time. Now, those diagrams A and B are Chris Alexander's explanations on the semi-lattice and overlaps. And when you look at that theory, Chris Alexander's semi-lattice theory, Grey Street is an example of how that plays out, and that, using theories, place theory through Alexander's lenses, one could see layers or analyze this precinct through various layers, and what becomes strong, or what comes through strongly, is that if architecture is properly conceptualized in an inclusive way, it becomes timeless. And through time, it allows through various, and in South Africa, there was a kind of a huge transition, politically, socially, economically. But yet, these spaces continue to be vitalized. They adapt over time. The problem is, the city seems not to be investing in taking care of these buildings. And what are we going to do about it? And this is where I'm talking about agency now. There are other gems. If you look at these arcades, layering of spaces, like bazaars, goods spilling out. And these are gems in our city. Looking at that figure ground that I showed you earlier, one can start to map these spaces, how the link can form all of these interesting arcades and places for interaction and overlaps that we need to make sure do not die or just do not get replaced. So this is a pick I took some years back, and for me, this epitomizes the Grey Street experience, because it is being, on one hand, in this kind of under this arcaded, colonnaded space, engaging with trade and shops and people, and being sheltered from the environment, but across presents this gallery of architectural wonder. So Grey Street is interesting to me because one gets this kind of conscious experience moving through moments in time in spaces like this, and these moments are through various interruptions, trade and other things, but it also becomes this kind of looking across this kind of visual fascination of architecture, of cultural expression in the built form. But now, what are we going to do about preserving this rich gallery? So for me, having looked at this precinct through many years, I mean, when we were in T4 1994, Len Rosenberg was with us then as well, and we were making models of various buildings there. And that started to form kind of an appreciation of the kind of architecture. But we need to take care of this precinct. And that's why I say architecture's agency, but not just architectural design, architectural thinking, architectural activism. What are we going to do as a community of architects about preserving these rich, complex galleries and not allowing them to decay? So these are my references for this particular presentation. But my work related to inclusive cities, there are book chapters and journal articles, also conference presentations. But there are various chapters here that if you want to read more detail about some of the things I spoke to, we would find them in these articles. So I want to pause now to take questions. I don't want to go much longer because it gets a bit, it could become boring for you. So let's start to interact. I hope there are some comments and questions. You can ask me anything about even my own experience through architecture. That's fine.
Yashaen, are you done with the presentation, or you want to break now and have some chat about what you?
No, yeah. So what I did is I went through parts 1, 2, and 3 broadly, and then now I want to leave the next, say, 40 minutes or so that's left for conversations around this, or comments and questions.
Okay, cool. Can I just start then? The image that you are showing here, nah? So what it's done and what how it defines Durban, etc. How would you marry? You understand when a heritage can come from another place, which is let's say colonial architecture in this place, and then make an impact in another city, in another continent. How do you marry the two? How do you marry what the space gives to the area versus the language that comes from outside South Africa?
So this language here, the Grey Street language, it's a mix of languages, right? So it's about, let's see, how do I answer? So you're talking about cultural heritage, right?
Correct.
Now,
there's a very rich cultural heritage, and you've analyzed the use of spaces, etc. So what I'm saying is, how do you marry the two, where you have colonial architecture versus something that architecture gives to a community in a completely different location?
Okay, so as I said in the presentation, that architecture always poses a statement, right? And in civic spaces, they're quite often political. And we talk about inclusivity, right? So although we have colonial architecture, and there's a reason, we need to understand the purpose of those buildings and what statements they made. But this is about, in architectural thinking, when we are more inclusive, and that's why I talk about perception as well, really getting to understand what the needs and aspirations of the communities that live and use the space are. We can start making architecture that that facilitate life. That in this case, it is about it was a live, work, play area, Grey Street. And the architectural expression, if you look at that section, came from a very, in terms of its form and plan, you look at the section, a very practical approach. Shop downstairs, covered walkway, living unit at the top looking over the street, which was a play space. But architecture, that's why I like Doshi's work, must allow the user as well to express identity. So this community here, if you look at the Grey Street community, it's an expression of cultural identity, but also functional usage and very pragmatic things about architecture. So yes, architecture will always make a statement, but for me, what is interesting about communities and places like this is how the architectural narrative becomes. What is it? Where does it come from? What's the genesis? So it's about response. In this case, it was a resilient counterposition. I see Karuni has a hand up. Maybe she wants to contribute to further to this.
Okay, cool. No, thanks for that, Yashaen. I guess what we are learning from that is that architecture as built form and style can contribute to something much richer than what you see. You know?
Yes, it's about what we consider.
And therefore a style that comes from another place can go to another area and become very valuable,
Mm.
but coming from a completely different location. Karuni?
Yeah.
Thank you, Yashaen. I'm just looking at this visual. I can spot Raf's Myatt in the picture. So I think just following on from what you just said now, there's such a rich interlinking and overlapping and layering of built form that happens within colonies. And I think Durban has that. We part of we're not isolated. Grey Street is not an isolated little enclave in Southern Africa. You get the same built form expressing itself in Zanzibar, in Mumbai. When I first went to Mumbai, I was completely surprised that it looked exactly like Grey Street. You know, this sort of picture says it all. You know, it's your shops below, you lived above. It's a very typical historical quarter, and you find them in all places in the world, probably in Istanbul as well. I haven't been there, but I think the importance of this picture in terms of your presentation is also about the need to unpack this, not just in terms of its built form, but in terms of its influences and where they come from. So, you know, I was fascinated with the first pictures that you put up about the extended family, you know, the way that your family lived. And, you know, if one just looks at that and considers, because my family lived in a similar situation at the point, and lived in a sort of design of a home that looked like this at the point, and then had to be relocated and moved to various places before some parts of my family ended up in Chatsworth. And the negative impacts of that as well, Yashaen. Very little research into that from architectural and spatial sort of angle is what was the impact of the 51/9 and 51/7 house on the extended family system and the social support that system gave the members of the Indian community who had urbanized far earlier than our local African community in Durban. So you didn't speak to that, but Yashaen, there's a gap there. When we were studying architecture in the 80s, we found very little research in that area. Len Rosenberg's research is wonderful. I think it's absolutely amazing because he opened up a whole history of what had taken place in the city, the way it had developed. But I'm talking more about the outskirts now. I'm talking about more recent history, 70s and 80s, you know. If one goes to your predominantly Indian townships now, like Phoenix and Chatsworth, you find that it's completely changed from the way it was designed. Even the people that live there, it's very diverse. And I'm just asking you, is there research in that sort of space? Is there research documenting that? Because it is architectural, it is urban as well, and it needs to get done. But Yashaen, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. If you could just ask those few questions for me. Thanks. But you know, just it's important to understand that we live in a system. And the colonial system is not an isolated system. And once people understand that, they would understand and me for myself as well, I have an appreciation of Victorian Edwardian architecture as well as Indian architecture. And the reason I have that appreciation is because my family has a heritage that is not only placed in Durban, it's actually placed in another continent. And the stuff that happened that got us here has impacted on me and my thinking and where I fit into the bigger picture. So it's interesting, that aspect around how do we see ourselves in terms of the bigger colony, because the whole world is a colony, little area, little port. Thanks, Yashaen. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. You're touching on some very important points. So what I can tell you we're doing at UKZN, okay, there are two grants. There's my Melon Decoloniality one that's touching on issues that you're talking about. But there's a big grant that I'm involved with as well in another project called the Melon Spatial Humanities Project. And in that project, we are looking at, it's interdisciplinary. So we got scholars from social sciences, arts, built environment, linguistics, etc., performing arts, drama, and various other scholars coming together, looking at three key areas, and this kind of evolution or the how communities and spaces and places and the narrative of architecture has come about as well. So I am representing the kind of architectural focus there. But there are also social scientists, there are artists, performing artists, etc. And the three areas we're looking at is the Durban city, the CBD area, Chatsworth, and Mlazi. And that's a very interesting study, and there will be seminars coming up on that as well. But that starts to look at various social factors, economic factors, displacement, people from geography and GIS and all that are part of it as well. So we're mapping stories, the stories of the becoming of place, and how communities, indigenous communities, settled communities, displaced communities have impact or were impacted by space, and how these various disciplines come together to understand the making of place and space and communities, and what you're talking about, going back to your heritage, which can be outside South Africa as well, as you said, and what do you bring with that, the kind of the social, the cultural values, and how does that translate into spatial thinking, perception of space and place, and architecture itself. So that project is quite interesting. And what you yes, so that question, Karun, is also raising a point that as architects we cannot just use architectural, traditional architectural thinking to understand the complexity of place. So I refer a lot to complexity theory and assemblage and all that as well, because there are so many factors. And the only way to really understand and appreciate this is through interdisciplinary engagement, but also people that have, and that's where the Spatial Humanities Project is important, the communities that have their stories to tell, their lived experiences, their memories of being in place through time. And those, it's now beyond critical. I mean, these conversations should have been happening 30 years ago, but we're kind of igniting them now. That's a very, very important area of study that we're looking at through that Spatial Humanities Project. Sorry.
Yashaen, thank you so much. I think what I like so much about the presentation, it was so personal. You got into your family space and how everything unfolded and how you grew up into these precincts, just to give us a good background of the people in Durban. So thank you so much for that. It's always better to, it's always great to hear someone speaking from the heart in that sense. And whenever something is personal, that's how you experience that. So thank you for that, Adima.
Thanks, Gura. Thanks, Yashaen. So I suppose there's, I just saw Kirk's comment about Sparks Road being a success, and I guess part of the reality is that time hasn't played the number on Sparks Road that it has on the rest of our city. And by time, I make reference also to forced removals and apartheid coloniality. But what's interesting, I think, from Karuni's comment is this idea that the world over has the experience of the rich, complex urban life. And I think Yashaen, and I'm sure others would be familiar with Lucien Lagrange's lecture for the Rule of Eight in Boergat Memorial 2 years ago, where he talks about apartheid as being an herbicide of epic proportion. And the reality is that we must make the acknowledgement that our urban environments have suffered a severe death and trauma in the separation of diversity from the space. But I think it's an interesting thing that you're suggesting, Karuni, about this gap that's coming in. And I know that Sushma Patel's research is starting to do that by looking at a very small cluster of the Indian community in the city center and in what we call Indian town. But I just wanted to also say thank you to Yashaen for shining a light on this and talking about the experience of an urban environment. And so obviously he's much younger. I have a much smaller or very limited reference in my mind about engaging in Indian town, but the description of Bond Street in particular and the overflow into that alley was just like going into another world. I remember as a very small child. And so that, what did you call it very, very diplomatically, the bums and tables? That was a lot of my experience walking through town.
I said butts. I was more diplomatic. Yeah.
But that, I think that serves to be a really informative part of the way in which we look at the world. And so we must ask ourselves, and I think that's what was the most enjoyable thing about your presentation, was asking ourselves, like, what is the necessity is evident. What is our responsibility as architects, as a community of architects and architecture students, which I see is quite nice in the participant list today. But what is our responsibility, and how do we enact that responsibility in resuscitating a dying city that is so rich in its complexity and in its relationships to a multitude of identities? I think Karuni also started, and you did not touch on that, this idea of the complex layering of presence within architectural typology and style, in inverted commas, colonial style and the supposed Victorian, Edwardian, settler colonial styles that actually mask a lot of vernacular Indian cultural practices within the courtyards and, Madrasa Arcade, etc. So we must also talk, I guess, to problematizing the singular language that we use when we talk about the architectural trajectory. But yeah, lots of things. And thank you very much for an interesting Friday start. Thanks, Gura. Thanks, Yashaen.
Thanks, Adima. Yeah. So you mentioned typology and identity. Well, style, I wouldn't call it style. It's about expression of identity. I think Sushma's work is referring to that, and she was talking to us about the families and and the making of particular buildings, a sample of them, and the families and their identity and what they express and things like that. So that's also talking about a community. What's interesting about Grey Street for me as well, besides this kind of spatial affordances through the typology that adapt through time, right, and through transitions and moments in time, is actually, every one of these buildings is a family trying to express something, but the way the whole, the assemblage, the composition comes together is so coherent. Think about it. It's complex, it's about people's tastes, but the community that built it were respectful of, or they had a sense of composition at an urban scale. And that's why I call it this kind of gallery that sits together in harmony. I mean, there are some horrible interruptions like Nickel Square Parkade, which really does a huge injustice to Red Square. And those things are happening. But generally in the Grey Street area, the way these things come together, the different buildings and the composition, the harmony, although they're sometimes quite diverse, and and that's why I say it's pedagogical. I mean, I could spend hours and hours looking at a picture and seeing different things about it. There are climatic responses, there are functional responses, there's expression of identity, and then there's principles of architecture coming through. Yes, Kirk's comment on Sparks Road, that's another area that intrigues me. And Sparks Road is quite different because it's not this kind of architecture, but what happens at Sparks Road and what I like about it is that kind of 24-hour vibrancy, and how communities function at different parts of the day, different times, at the edges, from the street to the insides and all of that. But I'm saying again, there needs to be much more scholarship in this area, and there needs to be much more advocacy, and much more speaking about this, because there's not enough. I mean, there's very, very little scholarship from architects, built environment thinkers around this area, and it's being allowed to decay, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Yashaen. I think when you're talking about culture, I'm going to invite people who have been in Durban for quite a long time to comment on that. I'm just a rural boy from the Eastern Cape. There's so many people on the call who've lived in Durban, who've experienced this part of Durban, and may look at it in a very different way. So, colleagues, I'll just invite you to come through to the conversation. While I wait for that, Yashaen, on the slight side, on the side of what you've spoken about before, but just off this topic, you speak about music and being a musician. Can you just elaborate on that?
Say it again, the Skura music, and I missed a few words.
I'm saying you speak about being a musician.
Can you
just elaborate on that, part of your life?
Yes, no, and how that also influences architecture and the Grey Street interest as well. So I was always interested in rhythm, not because I liked things being, loud noises or anything. Rhythm intrigued me a lot, and I always liked from little drum instruments, whether it's with sticks or hands and things. But I had the fortune of studying tabla. It's one of the most complex drums in the world. It's an Indian drum, 2 parts. And I like it because it is so complex and it allows various kind of patterns, overlaps, and you can do wonders with it. So I enjoy fusion music a lot and playing with, and this also kind of is this interest that I have in East-West kind of dialogues, because I like I studied a classical Indian music in terms of rhythm, but now I've reached a stage where I'm adapting, not just reached for a while now, and then working with jazz kind of musicians or Western musicians, that kind of looking at how things can adapt, change, create moods. But what I learned through music and where it's, it helps me in architecture is that, music I've been playing for like 40 years, right? And you develop intuition over time. And some things become second nature after a very long time. But through music, I'm starting to understand complexity, overlap. So if you look at Indian music, my master's thesis talks a bit about it, the theory of Indian music. It's kind of, it's akin to jazz. So it's very, it's about improvisation, overlaps, very interesting, the in-between. So spatially, in between notes is very important. So how that translates into architectural thinking is that it's between the note, which is the beat, and the space in between. So the value of the open space, the street, in the relationship between street and built form, open space, built form, add people in their transforming space into place. This all starts to make much more sense through engagement with various artists in music, and how through trying and engaging and really immersing yourself in the practice, but also the experience of music, wonderful things can happen. And I think in architecture, we can learn through pause and perception. Really pausing in space to understand what, and this is something that we really need to, I think, as a society, debate about architecture. We're in this world where just clients want things yesterday. But there are spaces, students, and us moving through spaces. I mean, we need to really develop our sense of perception and sense of what exists, but our conscious experience with what exists. So in music, it kind of evokes consciousness at various levels. And so does space. So some of the articles that I refer to, that I wrote here, speak about this kind of the scale of time, right? So the scale of time in music is quite easy to understand, and the kind of the number of moments you encounter through a journey. You translate that into a precinct like Ray Street, moving through it, through physical rhythms created through columns, etc. But the various overlaps, and that's where Chris Alexander's mathematical and architectural mind in analyzing space makes a lot of sense to me, because he starts to try to analyze numerically these kind of overlaps and complexities, which you can apply to rhythm and music as you can when analyzing place and space. So there's a lot more. It's not coming to my mind now. I had very little sleep for some reason last night. But yeah, we can have hours of chat about this, and I think time is a very, very, very important factor, and to develop intuition and ability where your thinking just becomes second nature, and the more experienced architects will know that. But now, when I look at young architects just rushing, manipulating software to create architecture, what has happened to architecture? And then it raises the other thing with artificial intelligence coming in. This kind of rapid production of architectural product is going to be done by other things. So why do we have to train architects? What are we training? So it's about pausing to develop architectural thinking by understanding through perception of being in place through time, be it colonial, be it cultural, anti-colonial, post-colonial, whatever. There's value in everything. All we need to do is spend time experiencing architecture and place to be able to develop responsive and sensitive ways of designing or thinking about architecture. So what I'm not happy about in the current environment is this product-driven software and 3D printing-driven approach to architectural design. We need to have a conversation about that.
I think Rodney Harbour wants to say something. Rodney?
I just want to thank Yashaen for a very interesting and challenging lecture. I mean, it's an absolute minefield of contradictions and interesting things. I actually spent the wartime years in Grey Street, and I remember it was just a full-length cricket pitch the whole way down. But what I wanted to talk about was, it's interesting to see who the architects were of these buildings. And when I was a young student, I was fascinated by the Ajmeri arcade, which he showed, leading up on the side of the mosque up towards the Emmanuel Cathedral. And I traced the architect, who was Wallace Payton, and went to his office to interview him about it. And we sat in this wooden paneled waiting room with a picture of the Parthenon behind. And I told him how wonderful I thought this building was, because I'd analyzed it for my thesis. And he said, "Oh, that." I said, "No, that's not very difficult. You'll find it in the last few pages of Bannister Fletcher." So it's interesting also to see who designed those buildings and where they got their inspiration from. And then to look at the plans to see how the people lived upstairs, but the toilet blocks were mid-block, they were separate from the buildings. And how this contrasts to what there isn't in Chatsworth today. But anyway, that's all I've got to say. I'm sitting in a room looking sideways at the battery. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. Yeah, so Skura, thanks, Rodney. I think you're raising something very important about some things in architecture are timeless, and there are some fundamental principles that make things happen as well. So, and I like Rooney's comment about this, you know, the joy, creativity, and value of studying architecture. I think we need to bring that back. I'm sorry to digress a bit, but because we're in the pedagogical kind of, the end of the lecture was about that. And about, quite a few of you engage with us at universities, either in juries or on validation boards with the SACAP review committees, etc. And I'm finding, I don't know, in the last decade or so, very little enjoyment, and I know there are quite a few students here, about architecture. It seems to be more of a pain and a bother than the kind of excitement. I mean, when I was a student in BTech, I mean, Len always still laughs at me for this. I asked for an extra design project, the one that was the Maritime Museum project, and my three other friends that were studying with me were not very happy with that. But I so wanted to do it. I asked for it, and we had to do an extra project because it was that excitement about doing something, exploring something wonderful that I may never, ever have a chance to do out there in the world. But it's about, but who's to blame about this? I think we all have to share in this kind of blame. We need to start inspiring students of architecture, and there needs to be much more dialogue between practice and academia. But our horrible structure in South Africa of this kind of when you reach a certain age, or if you don't have a master's degree, you're worth nothing to the university. And that is depressing, because there's a lot of value out there from people who would have experienced all of this. I mean, Rodney, Karuni, all of you talking now, that the university and students are not engaging with on topics like this. Are we very much into this approach of teaching content, creating clones, allowing students to become slaves of the computer and 3D, but we're not inspiring them or having these conversations with the students. So I have a module which I designed called Ethical Practice at University, and we talk about these things. We talk about ethical social practice and these responses, and some of this is from those lectures. But I think we all have a role to inspire a young generation of architects, whether they're students or young architects. I think the series can do a lot for that, to get young architects excited about a very, very rewarding profession in many ways. But we often sit and talk about doom and gloom about architecture. I mean, there's so much of good. I mean, I'd spent 20 years to become an architect, and nobody can tell me to date that I wasted my time. I get quite angry about it. I love architecture. I will not want to do anything else but it, you know? And I just hope that we have, I mean, South Africa has so much diversity. I mean, if you look at Durban, this presentation as well, it's all about diversity and opportunities to contest and to express, and not just to respond and do things for communities, etc. But we have to come together to do something, and that's about this agency through architecture I'm talking about. Because ultimately, yeah, we need to stimulate the kind of thinking and through conversations and contradicting opinions and experiences.
Thank you. I'm not sure, colleagues, if anybody else wants to add to the discussion.
Can you hear me, Skura? Hello,
Hello?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
It's Gav.
Hi, Jeff, how are you? Oh, I didn't see your hand.
Okay,
Jeff, you
Skura,
can go
I
ahead.
just wanted to, I just wanted to say a few words, and it's possibly larger than just dealing with the context of architecture and cities and space making, what have you. And the principal issues which face not just South Africa, but it faces the world today are simple, but very, very difficult to resolve. These are issues which Europe is facing right now, the Americas, and lots of other parts of the world. And the three things that they face are: one, the issue of race and migration, the issue of identity, and of course, there's finally the issue of demographics. Now, let's just talk about race quickly, because race is critical to how architecture responds. I mean, Grey Street in itself is not just an apartheid construct, it's a colonial construct. So apartheid began before the Dutch started, before the Afrikaner came into power. So the colonial apartheid is what created Grey Street. Now, migration is central to the issue of race. Migration affects Europe in a serious way. France is faced with these problems, Italy, Germany, and trying to integrate people from North Africa into their own communities. And the issue of identity then arises. Now, if you look at Grey Street is an evolutionary process. It may have started as something which is very Indian, and that is true. But if you look at Grey Street now, look at the people who trade in Grey Street. It's basically a trading space. You've got Chinese, you've got Pakistanis, you've got migrants from other parts of Africa, and they're all jostling and trying to trade in the same space. Then the conflict arises through race and through identity. And these are issues which are of a larger nature, and they need to be dealt with. And finally, it's the issue of inequality. And it's the issue of inequality and the opportunity to create a better life that needs to be dealt with. So these are not necessarily just architectural issues, but they're issues which affect economics, they affect trade, they affect sociology, they affect so many things. And in the past, there were lots of specialities, but specialities in themselves don't help. We need to look at the integration of the sciences, the arts, what have you, and form a more comprehensive approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think the whole point of these talks is being able to look into architecture, but being able to look beyond that. So I think your comment is very welcome. Thank you so much, Jeff. Yashaen, I just want to ask one more thing. You have done study on RPL.
Yeah.
And I want to find out, just in terms of your other activity, which was SciCap, just your view on how you feel that study was brought in as when you were president of SciCap, and how you feel that would have helped, the profession.
Yeah, so RPL, okay, it's a transformative strategy, right? So my position on RPL was really about, okay, implementing RPL, because in South Africa there are many who have architectural knowledge and skills that need opportunities for articulation, right? And they can't afford. It's becoming more less affordable to be in architectural school. But the book I wrote on RPL is really about the quality assurance. Now that's the issue. So remember, the recognition of prior learning is an alternative learning pathway. Now, for it to be successful, there needs to be public confidence in RPL, right? Which means, so the model I created for RPL that's published in my book is about a quality assurance mechanism to ensure that RPL is not a backdoor or a shortcut to professional qualification. So my work matched the NQF exit level outcomes set by SAQA with professional competencies that SACAP defined. But I used Bloom's taxonomy and other complexity of thinking, etc., to create a model that can be adapted across different professions. So my answer to you would be that any RPL, the success of any RPL system, to assure public confidence, to assure professionals as well that we're not flooding the market with people that do not have necessary skills and knowledge about architecture and practice, in our case, is that an applicant needs to go through a very rigorous process of evaluation. There are rubrics, etc., which score them and things. So the model I developed through my book is slightly different to the one SACAP's currently using. That's the one I first developed. But I kind of built on that one with more kind of quality assurance in there, which I'm willing to share. It's in the book anyway, it's published. Yeah. But RPL is necessary in South Africa given the kind of legacy. You know, I told you about my dad's story through engineering. I mean, RPL in engineering is a bit simpler. Why? Because engineering is more technical than architecture. I mean, we've got to think about things that we're talking about today. And there's no quick fix or shortcut to reach there. RPL, and if you have a proper rigorous system of RPL, it's inevitably going to pick up some gaps in knowledge and learning, right? And the other aspect of RPL through the national SAQA policy on RPL as well is to have a mechanism to bridge those learning gaps. So there's three ways in which RPL can be implemented. I'm just giving you a quick overview. One is RPL for access. If you want to access a program, you don't meet the requisite, say, minimum requirements to enter a degree, you can go via RPL if you've got work experience, you worked in a practice that is, you know, doing good work and you've been mentored properly and all of that, yeah. The other one is for advanced standing. So I have a cohort of students, some of them are online here now, at UKZN, and this was quite groundbreaking, which is via Rule GR7B. It's sort of RPL mechanism, which recognize competencies gained at NQF level 7, which is a bachelor's or BTech or BAS degrees with extensive practice experience. Students were able to access the master's degree, NQF level 9, without going through the honors. But that process was not just simply looking at a portfolio and admitting them. No, we had to evaluate them through rubrics, matching what competencies are required. So it's about what would they have accomplished had they done an honors degree, right? But furthermore, there was a gap. The gap was in theory and research methods, really, those two. So we had to run an extensive 2-month kind of module, almost with an orientation period as well, to bridge certain gaps. But the students that were admitted were not allowed to do their degree in minimum time, which is a year. So they're going over 2 to 3 years now in the program because they're constantly bridging or catching up, you know, bridging learning gaps through their research, through mentorship, through working with supervisors and others. And they're actually coping quite well. So that's going to be a success story that we want to publish at some point. So, Skura, the long and short of it, you must have a very rigorous assessment, evaluation process to gain public confidence in RPL. Otherwise, we're going to have all these miscommunications about somebody can, I saw one, 6 months, you can become an architect in 6 months. How? You know, and that's mischievous comments, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Colleagues, any other comment? Everybody's covered. And then lastly, Prof, I want to find out if the talk today has any influence, or and if so, how, in terms of your work, because I know that you see the practitioner as well.
Yes, yeah. So three things influence my work now, and that's what I was talking about. You know, when you asked me the question about music, that was great, because how I practiced 10 years ago to how okay, let's talk about architectural thinking. The way I thought 10 years ago to the way I think now is different. And it's because of these reflections of my journey through music, through being in places like this, to being more engaged with the work of Alexander and Doshi, etc., reflecting also on what I learned at university a long time ago, and also engaging with student dissertation projects and things now. These all has changed our way of thinking about architecture. And a lot of these principles in my own work, or in our practice work, I work in practice as concept architect, and it's coming through quite strongly, especially in placemaking. So my work is a lot about bringing in this kind of thinking and theory about theorizing and problematizing. So the first thing is, okay, let me answer directly. When I get an architectural project, or when our practice gets an architectural project, we first problematize that. So here comes this research methods where we ask the right questions about what is it we're trying to really do. Because by asking the right questions, we can have responsive architecture kind of emanating. Then, what are the clues that where do I look for clues that kind of speak to placemaking, inclusivity, and all of that? So these studies here, and why I'm more overjoyed in my studies in inclusive urbanism and urban inclusivity, more than alternative learning pathways, is because practice thinking about architecture is constantly evolving. So yes, it's starting to impact. Well, it has started to impact. And when I look at some of my previous works, I think like, oh my goodness, yeah, was I actually thinking architecturally or what? Yeah. Oh, Ken, sorry, Ken put a good comment here. Ken had just done a publication last year for the Inclusive Cities Saatchi's Chair. It's a chapter in the book where I focused on urban mobility, and I spoke about this precinct as well. It is published, so yeah. In fact, I had diagrams about cars and taxis, etc. I don't know whether I'd be able to share it now, because that's a real problem. So when I'm talking about preserving what was once, like Rodney spoke about the cricket pitch down, I remember stories from people that lived in this Grey Street precinct that spoke about the street, and that's why I call it a road now. I don't call it a street. It's because it was a play after hours play area, and it wasn't cut off like this. I'm going to, if you don't mind, Chair, just to share something that speaks to Ken's question. I'm going to quickly find it now.
Sure, go ahead.
Because that for me is also something that really concerns me about Grey Street. Oh, goodness. I'll find it soon. In the meantime, Skura, if you can just check what's going on in the chat.
Yeah,
Sorry.
the last comment came from Ken. Thank you for that, Ken. By the way, I think we've managed to make good contact with the city through Eric Epopin, and we are going to be part of quite many forums that will be published to members, where people beyond the regional community have to attend. But the city feels like exactly as how I feel, that many people obviously, that the architectural fraternity is just outside of what is happening in the city, but that is partly because you actually you don't know who to actually speak to actually engage in those things. So we want to be part of that. The forum that's going to come up, we'll send communication through the mail on that, in terms of Durban being a resilient city after the floods. During the floods, we had tried so many times as architects to volunteer, space planning, shelter design, and all of that, and we just hit a rock. And people were willing to volunteer their time for free, etc. And we just have not been able to do that. But I do think that we've got the right contact now going forward, just in building up with that comment from Ken, to make sure that we work closer with the city in terms of the forums that they have and the planning that they have going forward.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just run through. Sorry, I'll just run through this. Yeah, so this paper that it was written as a paper as well. This is the presentation I did at that symposium. It was about a humanistic approach to inclusive urban or public transport. And if you look at the problem, it was about a vehicle-dominated cities and also attitudes to public transport, mobility versus accessibility, exchanges versus overlaps. And what is neglected in all of these strategies and frameworks is the human city experience. So it's about wellness versus well-being, and it's about dwelling in place through time that I keep speaking about. And then I look at, again, a pedagogical kind of a thinking approach about how to engage with it. And when you look at Durban, it's a kind of a motor vehicle-dominated city, and I look at it like, I looked at it through the number of people moved by engine. And I consider motor vehicles as moving edges, cutting off the street as a public space, right? Okay, this you can read. It talks about, if you look at the OECD definition, mobility, maximizing access to opportunities, and it's more than that. I argue in this paper it's much more than that. What's neglected is this kind of psychological and spiritual experience of the city, moving through these spaces and dwelling and being in place. The reality is that we experience alienation at different scales because the design and thinking about our cities really focuses on access of motor vehicles, and it creates a whole lot of placelessness, which Grey Street is really suffering from as well. So the psycho-spiritual access to cities can break the shackles of apartheid design socio-cultural domains to afford complex cultural interaction, dialogue through spatial transformation. It's about infrastructure and built form narratives. And these things kind of formed a bit about what I talked about today. And I consider the city as a psycho-spiritual stimulating gallery. And we need to, it was that, and we need to get that back. So, okay, these were the theories that I kind of used. Of my framework was based on these. I don't want to get too much into this here. Right. So again, you can see I referenced Grey Street again. This was one of the, so the early, now if you look at the early colonial, this 1898 photo, because of the kind of speed of the motor vehicle, there was a sense of, these wagons and things, there was a sense of the street being a place. And I use Chris Alexander's semi-lattice theory to analyze that. Going through, we've been through, yeah. And then looked at mobility and movement. This is my own drawing of the apartheid city. Yeah. So I moved on to, yeah, and then what are the current kind of approaches? And if you look at how the city was designed, I mean, we created problems by design as well, right? I'm just going quickly through this. Then I dealt with the psycho-spiritual accessibility cut off by the dominance of the motor vehicles. I did some sketches. So these are some photos. If you look at, if Design Workshop hadn't done this wonderful bridge design, what did it mean for people on that side and this side? You know, it was like just, and look at Grey Street, just the other side of the city as well. It's just vehicles all over. So I did this diagram here to explain now what is going on. So if you look at the Grey Street precinct, which is this kind of gallery, and it was a live, work, play place. The reality now is these. So I did this plan and the section on the top, looking at just these moving edges, like almost blades, you know, cutting through the space, which really has taken away from what was a kind of a street for, you know, various interactions to something that is dominated by motor vehicles. And then when I looked at the kind of integrated development plan, etc., they speak about the walkable city, but these are all very pragmatic things. But I was looking at more also my experiences, like, you know, Strasbourg, right, in France. So this is a picture I took there, and you know, in this medieval city, which just became, you get a sense of place, the sense of street, of being, of dwelling, of pause, of a very enriching experience. Yeah. But we have to deal in what was a very rich space become this. I mean, because we focus on movement of goods and access to opportunities and services. And then I went into Chris Alexander and Balakrishna Doshi's approach. If you look at Doshi's Aranya, how he kind of very sensitively uses placemaking and the street and the courtyards to design the settlement, it's really good. And Doshi was trained as a modernist, yet he was able to adapt into this. There's a lecture I give on Doshi's work alone and the kind of complexity of the facades and things, but that's for another place. And then the other photo was in Shanghai. If you look at Ajmeri Arcade on the right, and this arcade in Shanghai, which I took in 2013, actually similarities. And I think some of you are talking about, you know, other places that, and they should give us clues about how we should be designing these kind of connections between these permeable edges, and the inside outside open space to build form relationships. So there is, so when I talk about mobility in cities as well, it's about human movement through space and time. Okay. And urban vitality is dependent on that, not jumping onto some motorized vehicle to move from one place to the next. I mean, are we really thinking about these things? And that's where I start talking about a proposition of decentralization, about bringing in other disciplines, integrating various experiences and intelligences to deal with this issue. But there's an article written on this as well that I've done. So, yeah. Sadly, it's a reality that Skura, you said you're engaging with the city, and hopefully they start to really take these things more seriously.
Yes. So the city is saying that they would appreciate more voice from the three institutes, planning, engineering, and architecture. And so we're working on that with Eric Appleton. And it's been much more fruitful talking to him than colleagues who are in our profession and field in the city. So I think hopefully we'll get somewhere with that. But colleagues, we've gone over time, but it was worth it. Thank you so much, Prof, for preparing that, and thank you so much for the talk.
Thanks.
Any last words from you?
No, I really I wanted to keep the talk short and was hoping for some provoking, thought-provoking questions and comments. Those did come through. So I am very thankful for this opportunity. I jumped at it when you called me, Skura, and but yeah, I'm saying I feel very honored to present to this audience because there are so many experienced practitioners and former professors and things in this. And it is a great experience because it also makes me rethink my own thoughts and the decisions I make. And I also believe that good architecture can only happen through conversations, and architectural practitioners need to come together as communities like this and talk about architecture, bring the youngsters in, inspire them, talk about architecture, and not just procure work. It's important to procure work, but we also need to advance our beloved architecture. I'm not even going to call it profession or anything. I'm just going to say architecture. And it can happen through these conversations and so many different inspiring comments and intelligences and experiences coming through. So I feel, although I presented, I've taken a lot away from this as well. And I really thank everybody for attending and contributing.
No, thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for the input. Meeting adjourned. I wish you all a very good weekend. Thank you, colleagues.
Bye.
Thanks, Yashaen. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.